Karen thought she owned the entire neighborhood, but when she planted spike strips in my driveway, she crossed the line. She wanted to control where I parked, but instead, she ended up in handcuffs. What she didn't know, I had security cameras, the police on my side, and a plan to take her down. Karens are crazy, and so are you if you still haven't subscribed to our channel. What are you waiting for? We have loads of videos to come. Moving into a new neighborhood is always a gamble, especially when there's an HOA involved. Some are reasonable, keeping things tidy and fair. But then there are the Karens, the ones who treat the HOA board like their personal dictatorship. I'd only been in Hawthorne Estates for a few months before I learned the hard way that our HOA president, Karen, was one of those types. She wasn't just your typical nosy neighbor. She was a full-blown control freak who thrived on making everyone's life miserable under the guise of community standards. Before I even finished unpacking, she left a typed warning on my door. Apparently, my lawn was 1 inch too tall for her liking, and I had 48 hours to mow it or face a fine. A week later, my wife Jenna got an earful because we had temporarily placed a flower pot too close to the sidewalk while decorating. Then came the driveway war. It all started when I parked my truck in my driveway overnight. Simple enough, right? Except Karen had some personal interpretation of the HOA rules that said no vehicle should be parked on a driveway overnight unless it was in an enclosed garage. This was news to me because I had read the HOA guidelines before buying the house, and there was no such rule. But that didn't stop Karen. The next morning, I found a violation notice taped aggressively to my front door. The letter, signed in Karen's bold all-caps signature, demanded that I immediately cease parking in the driveway and that continued violations would result in escalating fines. I laughed it off. There was no way I was going to be bullied into following a rule that didn't even exist. But Karen, she wasn't about to let this go. The next morning, I stepped outside with my coffee, ready to leave for work, when I noticed something odd. My truck was still there, but it had a boot on it. At first, I thought I had parked illegally, but that didn't make sense. Then I saw the sticker on the boot. It read, Hawthorne Estates HOA Compliance Division. What compliance division? There was no such thing. I had never heard of an HOA booting vehicles before. That was something the city did, not a neighborhood board. Confused and furious, I called a number listed on the sticker. And guess who answered? Karen. Her voice oozed with smug satisfaction. Oh, good morning. I see you've noticed our new policy. You can have the boot removed for a fine of $150. Or if you move your truck into the garage, I'll waive the fine this once. My jaw clenched. This woman was trying to extort me. Karen, I said, trying to keep my cool, you can't do this. HOAs don't have the legal authority to boot vehicles on private property. Oh, I wouldn't do that if I were you, she said in a sickly, sweet voice. The HOA has ways of handling rule breakers. She hung up. That was it. I wasn't playing her games. I immediately called the city to report what had happened. And guess what? The person on the phone wasn't surprised at all. When I gave them my address, the clerk sighed and said, Oh, her. Yeah, she's been reported before. That was all I needed to hear. I hired a private removal service to cut the boot off, took pictures as evidence, and emailed the entire HOA board, warning them that if this ever happened again, I would lawyer up. For a couple of weeks, things were quiet. No more notes, no more fines. Karen was suspiciously silent. I thought maybe, just maybe, she had finally realized that she couldn't bully me. I was so wrong. Because one night, Karen escalated to a level I never thought possible. I woke up to the sound of my neighbor, Mark, pounding on my front door at 5 a.m. When I opened it, his face was pale. Dude, you need to come outside. Right now. I threw on a jacket and followed him to my driveway. And that's when I saw it. Right at the entrance of my driveway, hidden just enough to not be obvious, were metal spike strips. Real, actual, tire-shredding spike strips. Someone had deliberately placed them in my driveway overnight. And I already had a strong suspicion of who that someone was. Karen wasn't just playing HOA queen anymore. She had just committed a crime. I stood frozen, staring at the spike strips gleaming under the dim morning light. My heart pounded in my chest as the realization set in. This wasn't just a petty dispute anymore. This was a deliberate act of sabotage. Mark rubbed the back of his neck, glancing around. Dude, someone did this on purpose. If you had backed out like normal, your tires would be done for. I crouched down to get a closer look. The strips were professionally made, not some makeshift nails thrown on the ground. Whoever placed them here knew exactly what they were doing. I carefully pulled one up and turned it over in my hands, my stomach tightening. This wasn't just HOA harassment, this was illegal. My first thought was checking the security cameras. I had installed them a few months prior, mostly for package theft, but now they were about to serve a much bigger purpose. I sprinted back inside, pulled up the footage on my phone, and scrubbed through the night. Then I saw it. At 3:42 a.m., a shadowy figure crept into my driveway. They were dressed in black, but as they moved under the streetlight, their face briefly became visible. My jaw clenched. It was unmistakable. Karen. She was hunched over, carefully laying the spike strips at the exact spots where my tires would roll over them. She took her time, adjusting them, even stepping back to admire her handiwork before scurrying off into the darkness. I stared at the screen, stunned. This woman had actually snuck onto my property in the middle of the night to sabotage my vehicle. I didn't hesitate. I called the police. The dispatcher listened carefully as I explained the situation, and when I mentioned that I had security footage of the suspect, her tone shifted. We're sending an officer over right away. Do not touch anything else. By the time the police arrived, a small crowd of neighbors had gathered. Some had seen me inspecting the strips, and word spread fast. Most of them had their own grievances with Karen, and now they were watching intently as I explained the situation to the officers. One of the officers, a tall guy with a no-nonsense demeanor, watched the footage on my phone. His expression darkened as Karen's face became visible. That's more than enough evidence. She trespassed on your property and set a trap meant to cause damage. That's criminal mischief and possibly even destruction of property. Another officer took photos of the spike strips, while the first one radioed for backup. It wasn't long before a police car pulled up in front of Karen's house. I watched from my driveway as they knocked on her door. There was a long pause before she finally answered, wearing a robe and a clearly fake look of confusion. The second she saw the cops, her face twisted into an indignant scowl. "What is the meaning of this?" she demanded, arms crossed. One of the officers held up a printout of a frame from my security footage. "Karen, do you want to explain why you were sneaking onto your neighbor's property at 3 in the morning and placing these in his driveway?" She barely glanced at the paper before her face hardened. "I don't know what you're talking about." "That's not me." The officer sighed. "Karen, we have you on camera clear as day. You trespassed onto private property and planted illegal spike strips. That's a criminal offense." Her eyes darted to the growing crowd of neighbors watching from their porches. She lifted her chin defiantly. "This is a misunderstanding. I was merely ensuring that community rules were enforced. That truck is a violation, and You are not law enforcement," the officer cut in. "You have no authority to enforce anything, and what you did was against the law." Her face twisted with rage. "I was protecting the neighborhood. He's been violating rules since he moved in. The HOA has the right to regulate driveways. Even if that were true, you're not allowed to booby-trap private property." That's when her whole demeanor changed. The smugness faded. She took a small step back toward her door, as if considering running inside. But the officer was faster. He pulled out his handcuffs. "Karen, you're under arrest for criminal mischief and trespassing." Her mouth dropped open. "What? No, you can't do this. I am the president of this HOA. I make the rules." The officer didn't care. He turned her around, cuffed her hands behind her back, and began reading her rights as she screeched about how this was an abuse of power. The neighbors, oh, they were loving it. A few even clapped as she was led to the patrol car. She continued protesting as they put her inside. "This isn't over. You're all going to regret this. I'll have you all fined. You'll see." As the police car drove off, I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. I turned to Mark, who was shaking his head in disbelief. "Well," he said, smirking, "that's one way to handle an HOA problem." I laughed. "I'm just glad I had cameras. Imagine if I actually ran over those things." Another neighbor, an older woman named Mrs. Thompson, crossed her arms. "That woman has been making everyone's life miserable for years. Maybe now we can finally vote her out." And that was the cherry on top. Not only was Karen facing real consequences, but this stunt might finally be the thing that got her kicked off the HO board for good. But just when I thought this nightmare was over, I found out Karen wasn't done yet. She had one last trick up her sleeve. For the first time since moving into Hawthorne Estates, I felt a sense of relief. Karen had finally been put in her place, hauled away in a police car, her reign of terror seemingly coming to an end. The neighborhood was buzzing with excitement. Some neighbors even started whispering about an emergency HOA meeting to vote her out for good. But I should have known better. Karen wasn't the type to go down quietly. The morning after her arrest, I woke up to the sound of my doorbell ringing repeatedly. Groggy, I pulled myself out of bed and checked my phone. 6:30 a.m. Who in the world was banging on my door this early? I threw on a hoodie and opened it to find a familiar face, Susan Whitaker, a woman I had never met in person, but whose name had shown up on enough HOA paperwork to be burned into my brain. She stood there in a stiff pantsuit, her arms folded tightly, a folder of documents clutched against her chest. "Good morning," she said in a tone so forced it was almost sarcastic. "I assume you received your violation notice." I blinked. "Violation notice? What are you talking about?" She frowned, then turned her head toward my porch railing. That's when I saw it, a bright yellow envelope taped to my front door. I snatched it down and tore it open. "Your property remains in noncompliance with community standards. Immediate corrective action is required, or further penalties will be imposed. Signed, Acting HOA President Susan Whitaker." I let out a breath, forcing myself to stay calm. "Susan, I thought Karen was removed from the board." She adjusted her glasses and gave a tight-lipped smile. "Karen is taking a leave of absence." "A leave of absence?" "She was arrested for felony vandalism and criminal trespassing." "That's not a vacation, Susan." She didn't even flinch. "Regardless, the HOA board has reviewed her ongoing noncompliance and has determined that further action is required." I narrowed my eyes. "Further action?" She reached into her folder, pulled out a printed list, and held it up. "Unauthorized driveway parking. Failure to submit a vehicle registration form. Disrespect toward an HOA board member." That last one almost made me laugh. Seriously? Disrespect toward a board member? That's not a rule. She sighed as if she was exhausted from having to explain things to someone beneath her. "The board has determined that a level of civility must be maintained among residents. Karen has expressed concerns about your behavior, and we take those concerns seriously." I stared at her, speechless for a moment. Then I finally asked, "Susan, did Karen put you up to this?" She hesitated just a second too long. Then she forced another smile. "Karen reached out this morning. She insists that she was unfairly targeted and that the neighborhood has fallen into chaos without her leadership." I almost laughed out loud. "She was arrested, Susan, for committing an actual crime. She says she was set up. That was it. I was done playing games. You know what, Susan? I'm contacting a lawyer. This HOA is about to get sued for harassment, fraud, and illegal enforcement of non-existent rules. I also have a direct line to the local news, and I bet they'd love a story about an HOA run by a woman who installs illegal spike strips." Susan inhaled sharply. "That won't be necessary." "Oh, I think it is. Because if I get another one of these fake violation notices, you'll be explaining yourself in court." She opened her mouth to protest, but must have seen that I wasn't bluffing. Without another word, she turned on her heel and stormed off my porch, her heels clicking aggressively against the pavement. For the next few days, things were eerily quiet. No more notices. No more booted cars. No more Karen. But I should have known it was too good to be true. A week later, I was just settling in for the night when my phone buzzed. It was a text from my neighbor Mark. "Dude, check your security cameras." I immediately felt a pit in my stomach. I pulled up the app and rewound the footage. At first, nothing seemed out of place. But then at 2:17 a.m., a figure appeared at the edge of my driveway. They were wearing a hoodie, moving carefully along the sidewalk. But when they turned their head toward the streetlight, I saw just enough of their face to recognize them. Karen. I felt a cold rush of anger as I watched her creep toward Mark's mailbox. She reached into her coat, pulled something out, and stuffed it inside. Then she moved down the street, stopping at every single mailbox. I immediately called Mark. Dude, I said, my voice low. Karen is back. What? Are you serious? I just caught her on camera. She's stuffing something into people's mailboxes. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Then Mark cursed under his breath. I swear to God, if she put another HOA notice in there, I'm going to lose it. I didn't waste any time. I threw on my jacket, grabbed a flashlight, and stepped outside. A few other neighbors were already on their porches, having received similar messages from Mark. We walked together, checking our mailboxes. And sure enough, inside each one was a new HOA violation notice, signed by Karen. She wasn't just back. She was running the HOA from the shadows. I knew then that this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. I stood there in the cold night air, gripping the fraudulent HOA violation notice Karen had stuffed into my mailbox. Around me, my neighbors were pulling out identical letters, reading them with a mix of disbelief and anger. She's still trying to find us? Mark muttered, shaking his head. She's not even on the board anymore. She's still pulling the strings, I said, flipping the paper over. It had all the usual Karen nonsense, claims of violations that didn't exist, threats of fines, and a warning that continued failure to comply would result in further enforcement measures. As if she hadn't already gone far enough. Mrs. Thompson, my older neighbor from down the street, sighed as she read her own notice. She must have made these before she got arrested. Who does she think she is? Karen's desperate, I replied. She knows she's losing control. Just then, another neighbor, James, jogged up, holding his phone. Guys, I just checked the HOA website. Karen's still listed as president. I froze. That's impossible. Susan said she was on a leave of absence. James shook his head and turned his phone around to show us. Sure enough, on the official Hawthorne Estates HOA website, Karen's name was still at the top, bolded under president of the board. She never actually stepped down, Mark muttered. She just let Susan take over while she figured out how to weasel her way back in. It was becoming clear Karen wasn't going to give up her power without a fight. I clenched my jaw. We need to shut this down before she pulls another stunt. We have proof of her crimes. Let's make sure she never comes back. We agreed to meet the next morning at the HOA office to demand answers. I barely slept that night, running through every possible scenario in my head. Would Susan fold under pressure and let Karen back in? Would the board actually listen to us? Or would Karen try something even more insane to regain her power? I didn't have to wait long to find out. The next morning, a group of us marched into the HOA office as soon as it opened. The receptionist, a timid young woman who clearly wanted nothing to do with any of this, stammered as we asked to see Susan. She's in a meeting right now. Mark crossed his arms. Then we'll wait. The receptionist gave a nervous glance toward the hallway before picking up the phone. After a few hushed words, she sighed and nodded. She'll see you now. We followed her to a small conference room where Susan was sitting at the head of the table, nervously fiddling with a pen. She looked up as we entered, her eyes flickering with recognition and fear. Before she could say a word, I tossed my own notice onto the table. Want to explain why a woman who was arrested for vandalizing my property is still listed as HOA president and is still handing out fake fines? Susan swallowed hard. Listen, I can. No, you listen, Mark interrupted. Karen is not in charge anymore. You said so yourself. So why is she still making rules? Susan exhaled sharply and sat back in her chair. Karen, she has influence over the board. Even when she's not officially in power, she still controls a few key members. They're pushing for her return. I felt my blood pressure spike. Return? She should be banned from ever touching this again. I agree, Susan admitted. But she's already calling in favors. She wants an emergency meeting to clear her name. Mrs. Thompson scoffed. Her name? She's a criminal. Susan looked pained. That's the thing. The charges were dropped. Silence fell over the room. My stomach twisted. What? I finally managed to say. Susan nodded grimly. The police let her go after she spent one night in jail. Something about a lack of serious damage to your property and community disputes being a civil matter. I clenched my fists. She installed spike strips in my driveway. That's not a community dispute. That's a crime. Susan sighed. I don't disagree. But she's playing the victim now, claiming she was set up and that you and your security footage distorted the truth. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Karen had gone away with it, and now she was trying to steal her position back. James stepped forward. We need to vote her out immediately. Susan hesitated. That's a complicated. The only way to remove her completely is through a community vote. I smirked. Then let's vote. Mark nodded. Yeah, let's see what the neighborhood really thinks about her. Susan tapped her pen against the table, thinking. We need to organize a formal recall vote. We need at least 60% of homeowners to vote in favor of her removal. Mrs. Thompson smiled. You'll get more than that. I crossed my arms. When's the soonest we can hold the vote? Susan looked at her calendar. 2 weeks. Then set it up, I said. Susan hesitated. You don't understand. If Karen finds out about this, she's going to pull every dirty trick in the book to sabotage the vote. I smirked. Then we'll be ready for her. Susan nodded slowly. I'll get the paperwork started. As we left the meeting, I felt something I hadn't felt in weeks, hope. Karen might have slithered her way out of trouble this time, but she had made too many enemies to escape completely. We were finally coming together as a neighborhood to end her rule once and for all. But I should have known Karen wasn't going to go down without a fight. Because that very night, my cameras caught something far worse than a forged HOA notice. Karen had one last, desperate trick up her sleeve. The night before the recall vote, I had a bad feeling. Karen had been too quiet. After everything she had pulled, it wasn't like her to just accept defeat. If I had learned anything, it was that she always had one more trick up her sleeve. I double-checked my security cameras before heading to bed, making sure they were all recording properly. The motion sensors were set. Everything was in place. If Karen tried anything, I'd have the proof. I just didn't expect her next stunt to be so extreme. At 2:30 a.m., my phone buzzed with a notification. Motion detected in driveway. I groggily reached for my phone and pulled up the camera feed. What I saw on the screen woke me up instantly. Karen, dressed in all black, was sneaking into my yard. But she wasn't alone. She had 2 other people with her. They were carrying cans of spray paint. My stomach dropped. This wasn't just some petty violation letter or mailbox stunt. She was about to vandalize my property. I immediately called the police. This is an emergency, I told the dispatcher. I have 3 people trespassing on my property right now, and one of them is my HOA president who was already arrested for vandalism. The dispatcher took my address and promised officers were on the way. But I wasn't about to just sit there and let Karen do whatever she wanted. I grabbed my flashlight and stormed outside. Karen and her 2 accomplices, both younger guys I didn't recognize, were crouched near my garage, shaking up spray cans. They had already started painting something, but as soon as my flashlight hit them, they froze. What the hell do you think you're doing? I barked. Karen's face twisted with shock and anger. But instead of looking guilty, she actually sneered. Oh good, she said, standing up. You're awake. Saves me the trouble of leaving a message. I glanced at the garage door. They had already spray-painted huge red letters across it. Liar. Rule breaker. Fraud. Rage boiled up inside me. You've lost it, Karen. She tilted her head, smiling. No, I'm just making sure the neighborhood knows exactly who you are before tomorrow's vote. One of the guys, who looked barely out of high school, laughed. Dude, you seriously called the cops over some paint? I narrowed my eyes. Yeah. And they're going to love the security footage I have of all 3 of you committing felony vandalism. That wiped the smirk off his face. Karen's confidence wavered for the first time. You're bluffing. I held up my phone. The camera feed was live. Smile, Karen. You're on tape. That's when the sirens started blaring in the distance. Karen's eyes went wide. She spun around, barking at the 2 guys run. The 2 idiots took off, sprinting down the street. But Karen, she hesitated, glancing at me like she still had a chance to talk her way out of this. She didn't. The police cars came screeching onto the street. Within seconds, officers jumped out, shining their flashlights. Hands where we can see them. Karen froze. One of the officers approached me, while the others chased after the 2 guys who ran. Sir, are you the homeowner? I nodded. Yeah. And I have everything on security footage. The officer's expression hardened. That's all we need. He turned to Karen. Ma'am, you are under arrest for trespassing, vandalism, and destruction of private property. Karen's entire body tensed. You can't arrest me, she snapped. This is my neighborhood. The officer pulled out his cuffs. Not anymore. As he cuffed her wrists, she screamed. This is harassment. You're all against me. I am the HOA president. I make the rules. No, Karen, I said as they led her toward the patrol car. Tomorrow, the neighborhood is going to vote you out for good. She lost it. I hope you all rot, she screeched as they shoved her into the back seat. You'll regret this. I'll find a way back. The doors slammed shut. The officers finished taking my statement, and after they reviewed the security footage, one of them shook his head. This woman is a menace. She won't be talking her way out of this one. I watched as the police car drove away, taking Karen with it. For the first time in months, I actually felt peaceful. The next morning, the entire neighborhood gathered for the recall vote. Karen wasn't there, of course, but her crimes were. Susan made the official announcement, reading off the charges against her, listing every single ridiculous rule she had tried to enforce, and revealing the security footage of her sneaking onto properties and planting fake violations. By the time it was over, the results weren't even close. Karen was removed from the HOA board by a landslide. When Susan read the final vote count, the crowd cheered. For the first time in years, Hawthorne Estates was finally free from Karen's rule. I went home that evening, pulled into my driveway, and just sat there for a moment, taking it all in. No more threats. No more notes. No more insane, power-hungry woman trying to control every aspect of our lives. Just peace. I smiled, stepped out of my truck, and walked up to my house without having to check for spike strips. And that was the best part of all. So what do you think? Did Karen finally get what she deserved? Let me know in the comments. And if you've ever had a nightmare HOA experience, I want to hear about it. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like and subscribe for more insane HOA horror stories. See you in the next one.